Good morning. As Liz said, I'm Jamie Hand. I'm the Director of Research Strategies here at ArtPlace. And I'm going to start by saying that if somebody told me a year ago, when many of you were at last year's ArtPlace Summit in Los Angeles, that I would be standing here in front of you about to talk about research, of all things, I wouldn't have believed it, not a chance. And of course, I know many of you not through ArtPlace, but because of your Our Town grants, and because of my previous role at the National Endowment for the Arts. So it's a joy to see so many of you and so many familiar faces and to get updates on projects that are now 3, 4, or 5 years into their unfolding. I'm also excited, in the same vein, to share with you a little bit of the evolution that has happened for me over the past year as I've pivoted from thinking like a grant maker and thinking like a practitioner to standing here in front of you as a director of research. It's a privilege and a daily pleasure to work with the team at ArtPlace, as Liz mentioned. It's a really wonderful staff, and it's actually hilarious and fun on a daily basis. And to take on the messy questions around creative placemaking impacts. Now, 75 minutes is a really long time to fill, no matter what you're talking about. But when you start to add methodological jargon and all the stereotypes about research being wonky and dry, it sounds to me like a pretty rough plenary. But I will say, so I'm going to try to do this a little bit differently and not just talk at you, but with you for the second half of this session. We at ArtPlace believe that some of the most interesting and most creative research activities are actually happening within this room. So we're going to have a little town hall style session. I'll go forward. Here's a bit of an agenda. We're going to have a town hall style session where I'm going to ask you to share with each other the ways that you are collecting data, measuring change, or communicating impacts in unexpected ways within your projects. What Laura and Dennis were talking about earlier about telling your story, I think that's actually one of the most interesting roles of research. These are ways that only artists and creative project managers would actually be thinking about research. So start the wheels turning now and think about things that you might be able to share in about 45 minutes. Before we get to that, though, I'd be remiss if I didn't provide, as promised, a little bit of a snapshot about how we at ArtPlace are thinking about research and what some of the research work is that's coming up. I've also recruited some colleagues who are basically rock stars in the world of arts and community development research to help present, just to take the pressure off me a little bit. I've asked Lynn Osgood of Go Collaborative, Rosario Jackson of the Kresge Foundation, and Victor Rubin, who you just heard from Liz, from PolicyLink, to present briefly on the different roles that research can play as we all work to advance creative placemaking and advance our understanding of the role that arts and culture play in community planning and development. So with that, I'm going to start with sort of big picture organizing framework that we've established for research at ArtPlace. Basically, we're going to be doing work that falls into 3 buckets, 3 categories. The first is measuring. What are the ways of assessing whether creative placemaking is successful? What are the metrics of success? What are the measurements? What are the things that you can be tracking in your community? Learning. How and in what context does creative placemaking work? When does it fail or have adverse side effects that we didn't intend to have? What projects have transferable lessons that we can highlight through case studies, toolkits, or other methods? And finally, translating. What is it that creative placemaking can achieve? And how can we talk about these outcomes and impacts in the language or in terms that the rest of community development can relate to? How do we get out of our own language and our own jargon and start talking in ways that public health people understand, that transportation folks understand? Again, these are themes you've been hearing all of us talk about, but this is the one that's pretty dear and important to us. So under measuring, for example, we've just finalized a master data collection instrument to harvest and track all of the projects in our national grants portfolio to truly understand the contexts in which all of our grants are taking place and actually capture secondary data about those places. We'll also be surveying all of our grantees to collect and aggregate measurement tools and tactics, both formal and informal, that can be shared with each other, with other practitioners. That's what the session today is really about, and that's what I want to hear from you. Within learning, Prentice and I will collaborate to curate some roundtable conversations among segmented cohorts of grantees to surface some of the sticky issues and some of the lines of inquiry that are really worth pursuing in the future. As Liz mentioned, we've also just gone through a really great RFP process that led to the selection of PolicyLink as our research and documentation partner for the CDI program. I think it's really clear, and those of you that know PolicyLink know that it's a slam dunk selection for us. We're so excited to have them as a partner in this work. But for a second, I just want to sort of give a hat tip and nod to the 14 fantastic responses that we got to this RFP. For me, it was a really humbling process and a signal that there's a hunger for research around creative placemaking. We had some of the most nuanced and rigorous thinkers in arts research, in community development research, and in social impact research coming to us to want to go on this journey with us. So it was a really hard decision to make on one hand, and I'm looking for opportunities to work with other researchers that are interested in this work through other programs. Building on what Liz said, the scope of work for PolicyLink isn't to do an evaluation of the program. It's not to say whether or not the CDI program as a whole was valuable or worth it for ArtPlace, but it's actually to look and learn along the way and to capture the richness of what happens during those next 3 years. And we do have many members of the PolicyLink team here in addition to Victor, so if you get a chance to say hi to Kalima Rose, who's sitting right here, or Millie Hawk Daniel is somewhere in the room over there with their hand raised, and Jeremy Liu is the fellow working with them. So any of those guys are here and can talk to you guys today. And last but not least, as I said, the translating bucket is sort of going to be the source of our signature research work moving forward, and we're going to be seeding a series of working groups over the next 5 years that are organized around, you guessed it, the community development matrix. This has been sort of the star of our summit, if you haven't noticed already. And the idea is that these working groups are going to bring explicitly cross-sector groups of not just researchers, but practitioners, policy leaders, and funders, thought leaders, and researchers, together to pursue very specific outcome-oriented lines of inquiry. For example, around health and human services. I sat in on the health and human services conversation yesterday, the breakout session. And I joked with them that I always use public health as my sort of straw man example when I'm talking about the idea of these working groups. And the reason for using it is that to me it seems like a very obvious intersection where there's a lot of overlaps, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of practice happening, specifically from the planning world, around the intersections of community well-being and place-based work. So place-based health is already a thing. And so for me that seems like, for lack of a better word, low-hanging fruit for us to pursue and really start to understand and dig into what happens when arts and culture is deployed or intersecting with health and human service work. For me, I would say, particularly coming from the arc of having been at our town at the NEA and now here thinking in a research mode, creative placemaking is huge. It's this giant umbrella. And one of the reasons that the matrix is really exciting for me is that it helps us start to organize and isolate some of the outcomes and some of the work that we're doing. It's not actually intended to sort of re-silo. I mean, everybody's afraid of silos. But I think for the moment, in terms of really getting clear about some of the work and some of the outcomes that we're talking about, let's isolate for a second and understand and look at very specific intersections. And take advantage of the fact that public health has a body of knowledge, a body of research, a body of metrics that maybe we can borrow from, not reinvent the wheel. So the idea is to use the working groups, and I'm going to show you a little diagram. This is sort of the rough outline of how they're all going to go. But to start to really pull together and aggregate and curate what these bodies of knowledge are. So I can't really see my images, but the first step is to conduct a field scan. So again, I'm going to talk about it in terms of public health, but this could be for any of the sectors. And I'm going to look to you all to tell me which sectors we need to pursue first. So the idea is to commission individual researchers to come work with us to do a field scan. And for a field scan, I don't just mean of projects. I don't just mean of ArtPlace portfolio projects, but where has there been a history of work at the intersection of arts and, in this case, health. Where are the relevant research and data sets? There's something called communitycommons.org, an immense effort from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, from Pew and others that are collecting all of the metrics and indicators related to public health outcomes in the community. Everybody here would be thrilled to use some of those when they're looking at their own work. So how can we use this sort of lens to pull that into our work? And again, thought and policy leaders related to this intersection, both from the public health side of things and from the arts and place-based practice side of things. We'll use the material generated by that field scan to move forward into, for ArtPlace, identifying not just who gets to come to this working group, but who could be a strategic partner, or strategic, co-convener with us. It's not enough just for ArtPlace to sort of hold a working group where we all get to talk to each other, great. A, because we're going away, which everybody has continued to say, but also how do we get somebody from the other sector that we care about influencing? How do we bring them into this conversation and sort of have them be a validator of the research that we're doing and the work that we're trying to get out there in the world. So for the public health version, maybe it would be Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who is a strong leader in health philanthropy, or Kaiser Permanente has a really interesting group called the Total Health Partnership arm of their work. Really, really awesome people, really progressive work. If we had Kaiser Permanente as a co-convener of the Arts and Public Health Working Group, that's going to do a different thing and land it in a different place than it would otherwise. And similarly, we're going to sort of think about a target audience, and this is where the translating part comes into play. How do we do this work? How do we sort of think about what we're producing with an eye towards how it lands? So in this case, maybe schools of public health. Maybe the next generation of practitioners in public health are the ones that need to hear and understand how arts and culture practice can influence their work and can help their work. We will convene the working group once we have that strategic partner and target audience identified. And again, as I said earlier, it's not just researchers coming together to talk. This is sort of a signature for me. I care about research that lands in practice. I care about researchers that are willing to sort of think outside of their areas of expertise and look at projects in a new and interesting way. So it's important to have the creative placemakers in the room, the people that are representing those projects that are worth diving into. It's important not only to have arts researchers and public health researchers, but also some social scientists, some ethnographers, people that are experts at studying community change outside of an actual disciplinary lens. And again, thought leaders, policy leaders, and other funders, I think they're critical to have in that room as well, because in some senses, for me, the term stewardship really matters, and it has a lot to do with our field building efforts around what happens when ArtPlace goes away. I think it's important for us to sort of seed some of this inquiry and some of this knowledge in other people that can carry it on after we're gone. And then the work of this group, and this is where, regardless of what discipline we're bringing together with arts and culture, the product at the end, the deliverables at the end, will all be somewhat similar. And the idea is that this is where we will lay out in one place what creative placemaking interventions can do. That's sort of the translational element. We're going to say it in the language that makes sense to that target audience. How the intervention does it, that's the sort of learning, that's sort of the case studies, the step-by-step of how these projects happen, and a way of knowing whether the intervention worked. And those are the measurements. So if we've collected, as part of this working group, some of the existing indicator systems or other sort of methods for understanding these impacts, we're going to wrap it all together and bundle it all together. So at the end of the day, we will have, a sort of library of multiple translational products that are really aggregating the case studies and the methodologies for measurement that we have worked to bring together over the night. And we only have 5 years to do it. So, the reality of whether we'll get to all 10 sectors or whether we'll be able to explore some of across some of the sectors where, for example, public health and transportation are often very, very linked. In our session yesterday, again, the reality was, oh, my project doesn't just belong in that box, it belongs in all of these boxes or 5 of these boxes. So we have some work to do in figuring out how we're really going to isolate it, but this is the game plan for now. So that's a sense of what we've got in store and sort of where we are now in the thinking. But I do want to finish the snapshot on ArtPlace research with a couple of questions that we've already snuck into our application process in order to get a better sense of where we should focus our research energies. So to me, in some ways, an application is the ultimate survey. And it's a really good opportunity to get information from folks that are already coming into us. So the first question is, ArtPlace has an interest in understanding the needs of the field. What is the one primary resource beyond funding or piece of knowledge that could improve the outcomes and impact of your proposed project? So none of you all had to answer this question in your application to ArtPlace, but the most recent round 5, had to answer this question. And this was the response for this year. So again, from the 2015, what were about to be made 2015 grants, the top 2 responses were best practices and evaluation methods. And those are my sort of shorthands for, everybody could fill in whatever they wanted to fill in. But in the quick analysis, I would also say the outside expertise and training, many of those also were about evaluation expertise or training and measurement and things like that. So it's sort of a clear call that we need to beef up our work in this area, and we really need to move forward on creating these resources and elevating and highlighting the work that can help practitioners do their work better. The next one is what projects or places, if any, have inspired your approach to creative placemaking? I've not yet had a chance to do the analysis of this question. It's sort of a big question. It's all over the board. But upon reading the applications, and other panelists who are here and part of this process, who just went through this, can testify that some of the same projects kept popping up. Some of the same places kept popping up. And so this is a really interesting question for us to pursue and really see which are the projects that we need to know more about personally, at ArtPlace, but also which are the ones that we can do a better job of digging into and highlighting and lifting up. And last but not least, my favorite, research jargon. We asked, Jamie mentioned this in his opening yesterday, and we say, what are you trying to change and how will you know whether you made that change? That is sort of the way we're talking about measurement. We don't want to talk about metrics. The word evaluation is scary to a lot of people. The idea that research is something that happens after the project is done by somebody else, that a funder makes you do, all of those things we're eager to really sort of get rid of that barrier and start talking about research in a way that makes sense and means something to your work. And it's something that actually you're doing on a day-to-day basis without calling it that. So this is sort of our attempt at saying, what are your metrics of success in a different way? Sometimes we say, I think as Jamie said yesterday, how do you know when to stop? Some people push back on that a little bit because sometimes community development work never stops. But if you're talking about a project-based lens and you're talking about a change and starting off with a goal that's change-oriented, you should know whether you made that change. And so you're going to actually come to some of those metrics yourself without realizing it if you're answering a question in language that's a little more familiar. And so sort of on the topic of jargon and sort of making research a little bit more accessible, this is not official in any way. This is not something that I want people to copy down. It's not a formal framework, but in a conversation actually with some other research folks for a panel later this summer, we started talking about the sort of overwhelming muddiness that happens when people talk about research. What is it anyway? And what do you mean? Are we talking about documentation? Are we talking about evaluation? Are we talking about learning? Those are I did a Venn diagram rather than a continuum because they do overlap and they are intersecting. But they're very different things. But they all count as research. And so again, not to dumb it down or oversimplify too much, but I think for the purpose of today, this is why I've asked Lynn and Maria and Victor to present. I've asked them each to sort of touch on one of these three things and really talk about the role of research as a documentation tool, the role of research as an evaluation tool, and the role of research as a learning tool. So without further ado, I'm going to bring each of them up. The first one is Lynn Osgood, who's going to talk about documentation. Lynn's an urban designer and a planner whose work explores the intersection of public space, community and architecture, and community and regional planning departments, where she's also pursuing her PhD in community and regional planning. Her current research focuses on the way artists can contribute to urban planning processes of the documentation project that she's about to present. And we've got folks from the NEA here who have worked long and hard with her as well. So I think you'll see very quickly why I was eager to include her in the mix today. So Lynn, coming up.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you all. So today I want to tell you the story of how we created the Exploring Our Town website with the NEA. Our journey began, it's a story about, essentially a story about stories. And we began in 2013. This was my firm, Go Collaborative, and my colleague Sarah Gamble. And we wanted to create a website that was able to capture the knowledge and information that was out there around the projects of the Our Town program for the NEA. Working with Jason Schupak and Jamie Hand and Jennifer Hughes, they talked about having a mountain of information, but not having necessarily a way to get these stories and these ideas and this knowledge out to a larger audience. And I think, as we know, just by being with each other for these past day and a half, there's an enormous amount of knowledge and stories just within this room alone. And so our task was, to create a way that could tell the stories, but they weren't just typical stories about community development. They were stories of community development that happened through the arts and so unfolded in very particular and unique ways. These slides that I just showed are from the project Planet Hennepin in Minneapolis. And this is a wonderful project. It was in many ways a standard planning project where they looked at how could they transform Hennepin Avenue, but what was wonderful about it was they brought artists right into the middle of the planning process and used choreographers to ask, what is your experience like when you walk down the street? What does your body experience? They brought in musicians to say, what are the sounds that meet you when you come out of a building onto the street? And so these projects unfold in wonderful ways. So the project itself, the website, we were very fortunate to have a wonderful team. We had HyperAct, who did the web design from New York City, Intermedia, who did the platform design there in Austin, and writers John Gendel and Alec Applebaum. And we worked with them to gather information from many project managers, many of whom are here in the room today. And so we want to thank you for your help in gathering the stories. I encourage you to look at the website. There's two main sections to it. The first half is, there's one side of it which captures all the case studies and the stories themselves. The other half talks about the lessons learned. And we were able, through the process of creating the website, to send out a larger survey. And from that, we really tried to learn what were both the highlights, but also the difficulties and the challenges, and how can we learn from them sort of across the board. But for the purposes of today and this morning, what I want to talk about is the research process that we used in learning how to document these projects. Because again, we were looking at many, many different projects that unfolded in many different ways. So the question was, what were the elemental ways that we could capture them, bring them together, and tell stories in a way that would be compelling, that would work with all this very complex data, but in a way that would be clear and elegant, and that would work for a website. And in many ways, it was a wonderful discipline, because we had to figure out what were these ways that could just easily flow from this very complex data that we were looking at. And so the research framework that we used was a different amalgam of different qualitative techniques. And in many ways, it paralleled the work, if any of you know the urban designer Kevin Lynch. Now, Kevin Lynch was an urban designer who worked in the 1960s. And he did work that he went to different cities and asked people to just draw maps of their city. And they would draw them, and we've all done that, drawn places where we live. And from that, though, he was able to develop a typology. And this typology called out those specific elements that people kept bringing up in their pictures. There were the landmarks, the nodes, the edges, the paths. And what's interesting, I teach a course in planning at the University of Texas, and so I see a lot of urban design and development theories come and go, but since the 70s, no one has tried to take Lynch's work away. For some reason, it just makes sense. Yes, this is when we understand our cities, these are the categories that come into our mind. So for this project, though, we needed to come up with a way that wasn't going to talk about spatial aspects, but was going to talk about narrative. So what were those points? What was that map that people had in their mind as the stories of their projects unfolded? So we used a number of techniques. We were very lucky. Through this work, we were able to visit 5 exemplary projects. We went to, this is a picture of Watts in Los Angeles, in the Watts community, and the work they were doing. We went to Portland, Maine, Reedsburg, Wisconsin, and I know Salinas is here today. Opelika, Florida, and Fargo, North Dakota. Very wide range of projects and locations. And so we walked around with people, and we got tours. We did interviews, both individual and in groups. We also did a lot of background research into, what was the organizations and the larger context of their project. But ultimately, the research came down to these small rooms. And what we did was we asked the project managers to gather 8 to 10 people. 8 to 10 people who had been involved in the project almost from beginning to end, as much as they could. And these were a wide variety. We asked for a wide variety of folks. They could be project managers, volunteers, city officials, artists, whomever it was. But they were people who knew the project from many different viewpoints. And what we did was then we gathered them around a table and said, okay, for a moment, just think about your project, nothing else. Think about what it was that you experienced, who you were with, the good things that happened, the challenges that came your way. And then we asked them to write down on note cards a word or a small phrase that captured all of those images that were going through their mind. And then what we did was we taped them up on a nearby wall and made sure, when we read through the cards, to make sure that everyone, was clear about the information that was up there. And then what we did was we had them sort them into different categories. This is where those categories of understanding started to emerge. But this is what I love about this particular technique, is that we asked them to do it as a silent sort, which means there's no talking. And what I love about this technique, for any of you who facilitate group meetings, you know that there's always power issues to mediate within any meeting. But in this, when you're silently sorting, those power issues start to level. And one of my favorite examples of this is we were in Los Angeles doing one of the case studies. And there was this young architectural intern. And she reached right over in front of a university president, grabbed the cards, and moved them where she knew they had to go. But this wouldn't have happened if they were sitting face to face and they were talking and using words. And so what emerged out of all these 5 cases, all these projects, was 5 different ways of creating that typology of what in people's minds, what were the categories of these stories and how they took place. So from that, then, we were able to develop, what we found was that across all 5 projects, and we were very relieved that, yes, there were, in fact, different typologies that came across all 5 projects. There were, in fact, 8 that came up again and again and again. And then we took those and we made those into 4 larger categories. So those are understanding community and people talking about place and community. And they talked about them in different ways. I'll say more about that in a minute. The second one was envisioning the project, with talking about both local needs, very clearly talking about needs, but then also talking about what was the vision that came to the project. The partnerships, and really talking about the necessity and the clarity of those partnerships and the logistics that were involved. And then the last one, measuring project results, talked about anticipated results and unexpected results. Now, this may seem like just sort of a basic scheme. Yes, everything does fit in there. But I want to draw, what is it that about this schema that is actually unique to the creative placemaking work? And so I want to draw attention to 2 of the things, sort of at the beginning and end. One of the things that was very interesting in the work when we saw those first 2 categories of place and community, with those projects, with the exemplary projects, and as we saw in looking at the many, many case studies that we talked about later, was that there were people, the projects really talked about the place itself, the history, sometimes the geography, the politics, but they also separately talked about the people, the demographics, the narrative, the stories that people had. And what we found was that those projects that were really the most compelling talked about those very, very strongly, because those were the ones that were the most deeply grounded in what they were doing. And then in the last one, the anticipated results and the unexpected results. One of the things that I think was the greatest honor of getting to talk with everyone about their projects was not just talking about what they wanted to happen and what transpired, but that in everything there was a little bit of magic. And how was it that we could capture in that way what it was, the not just unexpected, but really wonderful changes that happened across all the stories. And so we wanted to make sure that there was an area where we could capture that and those stories could be told. So to illustrate sort of how this all came together, I want to tell the story of the Opa-locka community gateways. Now, the Opa-locka story is really, it centers around the story of one man, Willie Logan. Now, Willie Logan grew up in Opa-locka, and and to tell you about Opa-locka as a community, Opa-locka is right south of Miami. Now, for those of you that remember Miami Vice, in the 1980s, Opa-locka, Florida was the center of the drug trade. And the reason for that was that there was a certain configuration of highways that people could get on and off the highways very quickly to drop off drugs and pick them up and get them on their way. And in Opa-locka, and Opa-locka was really the hot spot for this. And in Opa-locka itself, there was an area called the Triangle. They've now rebranded it as Magnolia North. Now, strategic. Now, and so Willie Logan grew up in this neighborhood. And since the beginning, he wanted to affect change. Early on in his career, he became mayor, and he also started the Opa-locka Community Development Corporation. Now, Willie Logan is a man that knows how to get things done. They do affordable housing, and they do really incredible work bringing many units to that area. But art was new to Willie Logan. He had never worked with artists before. But he thought that but when they saw the Art Town grant, they said, this may be a way that we can come in and do something about what were, in effect, these barriers. And let me tell you the story of the barriers. So in the Triangle, so imagine drugs coming in and out of this very small area. There were, this was back in the 80s, Willie Logan, who was then mayor, had heard about this wonderful new design trend going on in Florida called gated communities. And he said, this is the answer. This is what we need. Because what they did was they, in effect, blocked off all the entrances to the Triangle except one, and then stationed a police car there. So the drug runners couldn't get things in and out without crossing the police. So, you know, it worked. It absolutely worked. But what also happened is that the people that couldn't escape because of economic reasons were the elderly and the single mothers. So this is a picture of the barrier itself. So this is, in essence, an understanding about the community. It is a community that has an incredible history of living in relationship to Miami and the drug trade. It's a story of a community, also a very tight-knit community, in this small triangle of the elderly and single mothers who are just trying to eke out a way to survive. Now, so in envisioning the project, as I said, Willie Logan had never worked with artists, and he didn't know how it was that he was going to bring them in. Let me say, he didn't know how to work with artists, but he knew that he knew people who could help him. So this was the key thing. He brought in partners. And he brought in partners from the County Public Art Program, and he brought in partners from area museums who could advise him on how was it that arts could inform this way that they could address these issues. So what they did was they brought in, they put out a call to artists, and they brought in 4 artists. One was R&R Studios, who helped them think conceptually about urban design and really created a scaffolding for what it was the other 3 artists that would be doing work. Now, in how this project unfolded and making it happen, that actually centered on the artists themselves. There were, R&R Studios created the scaffolding, but then there were also 3 other artists. Jermaine Barnes was a young architecture student who worked with his advisors, and he actually went and he lived in the community, and he did a survey of all the houses that were there, and they saw that what the community had was a number of abandoned houses. What the community needed was sites for microenterprise. People wanted to be entrepreneurial, they wanted to garner income, but they didn't have places and structures that could actually help them do it. So his proposal was an architectural intervention. And they made sites where people could sell pies, do laundry, give haircuts. The other artist was Walter Hood, landscape architect, and we saw some of his work yesterday as well. He looked at all the car shops that were up and down the avenue, and he actually took some of the rearview mirrors and created a community park that literally reflected the neighborhood back to itself. Now, in talking about measuring results, the last artist that I want to mention was Gail Fulton Ross. She was also part of the making of the project, very much so because she went into the neighborhood and talked with everyone week after week after week. And her proposal was to make a sculpture of a woman's head out of iron rods. Now, this was incredibly powerful for this community because they were mostly either raised by single mothers or single grandmothers themselves, raising their families. So this image of the woman's head was incredibly powerful for them. Now, this is where we talk about results, because For Willie Logan, this man who's really an affordable housing developer, did they get at that result of bringing down the barriers? No. And in fact, well, at the time that we were talking with them, they were actually meeting a lot of resistance from the city about bringing them down. But what had happened was a process of transformation for both Willie and his organization. Willie Logan, in my interview with him, said, you know, I work a lot with the youth. And a lot of them talk to me about how they want to get out of the neighborhood through sports. And he used to try and dissuade them, but now he talks to them differently. And he says, your creativity is your God-given right, and no one can take that away from you. That is what you need to work to develop. And so he's changed his organization, and now art is very much a part of everything they do in community development, and it's a part of all the affordable housing that they develop. So I think the question then is, in terms of, for this panel, documenting the process and what did we learn? We learned that by going to these different projects, that there really was a way to understand how they unfolded, and there was a compelling story to tell. And that at the end of the day, what we need, both for ourselves and in this room and for everyone outside, is just very good, clear stories. Thank you.
So next up, we have Maria Rosario Jackson, who to some needs no introduction. She's Senior Advisor to the Arts and Culture Program at the Kresge Foundation, where she began working with the Arts and Culture Program and team in 2012 as it developed a creative placemaking strategy. Maria is also the former director of the Culture, Creativity, and Communities Program at Urban Institute, where she was based for 18 years. There, she led research on arts and culture indicators, measuring cultural vitality, arts and culture in comprehensive community revitalization, development of art spaces, and support systems for artists. Maria is an adjunct faculty member at Claremont Graduate University in California, and she earned a doctorate in urban planning from UCLA and a master's degree in public administration from the University of Southern California. In 2013, President Obama appointed Maria to the National Council on the Arts. She's here to talk with us today about evaluation. I'm also going to say really quickly, with no intention, all three of my researchers today are also urban planners. That might say more about me than about them.
So good morning. I want to start by thanking Jamie for inviting me to be a part of this and for tasking me with talking to you about the E word. So my remarks on evaluation are, they're anchored in experience currently, my current experience with Kresge, as well as many, many years in working at the intersection of arts and community development and some of the work I was doing at the Urban Institute. And I wanted to just start by saying that the evaluation, as I see it, in its most beneficial light, isn't something that happens to you, but something that you do as part of your process. So I think a lot of times people think about evaluation as this exogenous thing, right? So there's a third-party person who may or may not be well-versed in what's happening in your locality who's going to come in and give you a grade. They're going to make a judgment about you, and that's scary. It can be angst-producing. And I would encourage people to think about evaluation, not so much in those terms, but to think about evaluation as that inquiry that you are committed to better understand how you're progressing and to make decisions about how to continue and if you continue. So it's much more an internal process at its most useful than it is exclusively an external process. And I just wanted to share a few insights with you that I've accumulated over the years that I think are very applicable to this creative placemaking space that we're all in now. So some common characteristics of art-based community change strategies, which is really what creative placemaking is, another way of thinking about creative placemaking, is that they're catalysts for action that are often beyond immediate control, and that they seek to affect social conditions of great magnitude. So a lot of times, the creative placemaking work has some pretty ambitious goals. It's about, in some cases, turning around communities that have for decades been disinvested, or working with populations that have a history of disenfranchisement. So there are some big issues, even in thinking about transportation systems or environmental conditions or any number of things that are in the matrix that Jamie has shared and that other ArtPlace staff has shared earlier. There are all of these big issues that we hope to be able to affect. These initiatives rely on a wide variety of collaborators and dissimilar collaborators. So there's social service agencies, community development corporations, schools, health organizations, the arts entities themselves. So it's this coming together of forces, in some cases, that may not have come together before. And really importantly, they can be accountable to multiple paradigms of success, as well as possibly competing or conflicting expectations. So people kind of nod, yeah, that you've experienced that. So you have different points of view around the table, and what success means in one realm may look a little bit different for what it means somewhere else. So just last week I was in a conversation, it was very rich, and we were talking about the idea of opportunity and what does opportunity mean in low-income neighborhoods. And a colleague from the federal government said, well, in the federal government, opportunity means jobs. And that might be a very valid way of thinking about opportunity, but someone else may think about opportunity differently. And for them, the end goal is perhaps something a little bit different or significantly different. One of the challenges of coming together from different sectors and trying to do something new is that it often takes more time, and it's difficult. So we're asking people as you invite them to engage in this work, in some instances to work more slowly, and to take on some challenges that they haven't taken on before. And unfortunately, sometimes the pace of the work doesn't align with the industry standard of efficiency, right? So you have in construction or community development, you have a clock that's ticking at a particular pace, and that clock may not be ticking at the same pace that you need the clock to tick for creating new collaborations. So there's a timing issue that sometimes doesn't align really well, and it's really important to take those kinds of things into consideration. So these are some of the characteristics that probably are not very far off from some of the things that you've experienced in your own projects. And I wanted to offer some insights about the idea of evaluation as I started this, thinking about evaluation as part of your practice. So not evaluation from the here comes a third party and I'm going to tell you how you're doing, but from that internalized, we have a practice of evaluation and this is how we're going to carry it out. So hopefully these are helpful to you, and I'm really eager to get to the conversation part of this. So first, identify the full spectrum of stakeholders in the initiative and the range of expectations present, and develop common ground about intended impacts and measures of success. So I've talked about that a little bit already. Who's at the table? Who are you accountable to? And this includes your funders as well as the community members that you are accountable to in these particular places, in addition to your partners who are with you in this project. You know, what is it that where there's common ground, and where is it that you have to negotiate some really different kinds of expectations? And to be intentional about doing that early on, I think is really, really important. Be clear about the full range of activity and circumstances implicated in achieving project goals, and identify the piece of the puzzle that you're contributing to. So again, when you're thinking about these big issues of great magnitude, there are lots of things that affect that, right? So there are the politics of the locality, there are the resources available in terms of either public entities or philanthropy or corporate sector, there are local politics on the ground at the most grassroots level. There are all kinds of considerations to be aware of, and figuring out if, for example, your interest is in reducing poverty or in increasing connectivity among groups that are divided. What are the things that have to come into being in order for this to sustainably happen? Right? So you really need to think about what are all of the different forces at play here, and what role do you play? What can you affect? And be clear about that. And the intention of doing this isn't to foster paralysis because it's so complicated. That's not the point. The point is to understand that you're involved in a complex system and complicated work, and that you have something to contribute in that complexity. So don't be tempted to take full responsibility for impacting conditions over which you have no direct control. And for years, when I was at Urban, and I would, there's some giggles in the room. Say that again? Say that one again. Okay, so do not be tempted to take full responsibility for impacting conditions over which you have no direct control. And again, here, it is about calibrating your own expectations about what's possible. And this isn't about bridling or encouraging people to hold back in their passion and desire to see change, but it is about recognizing what it is that you can actually contribute and where you have to rely on others to help get to the goal that hopefully is shared, right? So to step back and be able to say, yes, I had a hand in this change, and I had a hand in this change in collaboration with others who contributed these other pieces, that seems a much more healthy and appropriate place than to imagine yourself trying to take responsibility for this big thing that you really can't control. So figuring out what that piece is, I think, is a really important element. Avoid putting all energy into attempting to prove that an intervention caused a particular outcome. So this is a focus on causation. And some people will disagree with me about this, and that's okay, but this is my particular point of view in my 10 minutes up here. And I think that sometimes there is an impulse to try to claim full responsibility, and there is sometimes political pressure to be able to, you're on the hook, right, to be accountable for something in a way that perhaps isn't appropriate. So to think about causality and to put energy in that is to discern everything else and say this was directly a result of that. And we know that in the context in which we work, it's much messier than that. It's much more complicated. And I think a better use of time, energy, and resources is figuring out, again, what piece you're contributing to something as opposed to thinking of that causal relationship and trying to be accountable to that. Now, that said, this becomes difficult when you're working across policy sectors and the way of working in other sectors is guided by research that is about establishing causation. Right? So some of you may be in that position where you're okay with thinking about this correlation, this contributed to this, but you're working with people who are looking for at another level for proof of something to happen. So negotiating that can be tricky, but I would still encourage you to not put all your energy in trying to service causation. Next. Figure out what kinds of data are needed to demonstrate possible impacts, and don't assume that benchmark data and recurrent measures are readily available. So if you think that you're going to affect a change and over time you want to track that, be clear about what kind of information is out there that can give you a sense of what things look like now, and is that data available in a recurrent way over time that will help you understand if things changed. And it's important to do that at the very beginning, just to be sure that you can, in fact, track the things that you're interested in tracking. And you may find that the kind of data that you would ideally want may not be available. That doesn't mean that you abandon the intervention or that you abandon the project. It means that you think out of the box for, if not clear indicators, quantified data that tell you something is moving, that you think about indications. So I'd like to make the distinction between indicators and indications. That's just my thing. But indications are a little different because you're not relying on hard data, but you're relying, it's kind of like breadcrumbs, right? So I'm seeing some change. I may not see the numbers move yet, but there's been a policy change that is favorable to the thing that I ultimately want to affect. Or there is evidence of some new entity, whether it's an organization or a building or a space, that is going to get me closer to the thing I want to ultimately affect. So that may not be an indicator, but it is an indication, right, that something is moving in the right direction. And I think it's important to pay attention to those. Another point is to use both qualitative and quantitative work to assess your progress and to work with professionals who are skilled in this to help you develop your systems for assessing and ultimately be able to tell the story of what happened. So a lot of times there's an overemphasis, I think, on quantitative data at the expense of qualitative information. And I think at its best, you're able to talk about something with both kinds of tools. And when I was doing work at the Urban Institute, working with organizations on the ground on evaluation issues, often I would ask them the question that Jamie brought up, which is, how do you know? How do you know that you're making change? And they would sometimes point to indicators, meaning they had hard data to show it, or they would point to what I call indications. They had other kinds of evidence that they were moving in the right direction. And I think a lot of times people relegate the qualitative work as anecdotal, which bugs me, because it's important information. And if you go after, quote unquote, anecdotal information with intention and rigor, it is much more important than people may initially interpret it as, right? So if you are intentional about getting feedback from whether it's clients or stakeholders or whoever it is that you're working with, if that is part of a rigorous way that you are collecting information to help reflect back to you how you're doing, that's very valid. It's not as valid, however, to have sporadic kinds of evidence, right? So yeah, we get letters from people sometimes that tell us we're doing well, as opposed to we seek out the information from people to give us some feedback about how we're doing. Another point is to be proactive and commit to sustainable methods of systematically, reliably, and recurrently assessing your work from the very beginning. So I actually started with this bullet point. I think this is part of, at its best, it's part of how you do your work. Don't burden a single evaluation with the functions of a mature body of research. So oftentimes an organization, because it is passionate about something, they put all their eggs in the basket of evaluation and say, we are going to definitively prove that this is a precedent for this kind of investment to happen over and over and over. And it's laudable that there is concern for making that kind of contribution, but it isn't credible, and it's not appropriate to think of one instance and to have that be a precedent that could be understood as a body of research that takes many, many years to develop. That said, and this is my last point, I think it's really important that to the extent that you can, you see your evaluation efforts as contributions to the broader field. And I think here at this convening, there have been there's been lots of evidence of that, right? When people are willing to talk about their successes and failures, and they have stopped to reflect and assess, and they're willing to share with colleagues what's happened, and how they intend to work differently, perhaps as a result of that understanding. So I hope these were helpful, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Okay, and last but not least, Victor Rubin is the Vice President for Research at PolicyLink, and has been an urban planning researcher, teacher, and consultant for more than 30 years. He joined PolicyLink in 2000 after serving as the Director of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of University Partnerships. He has an extensive background in policy research and evaluation pertaining to childcare, education, employment training, and economic inclusion. He's formerly adjunct associate professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley, where he earned both his master's in city planning and his PhD. Victor. And because I'm a horrible time manager, we're going to go right up against the town hall session. We're going to go right into that right after Victor's presentation.
So the revenge of the planning researchers. I love it. We go to a lot of meetings, and we do a lot of work in infrastructure, and the meetings of the sewer and water guys are not half as colorful or creative as yours. It's just one of the many reasons we're delighted to be joining with ArtPlace. But Kalima may be disagreeing, I don't know. But the openness to learning that we've seen already, the commitment to equity, the sophistication about the role of philanthropy in relationship to government, and the role of philanthropy in relationship to the community sector in terms of changing government practice and engaging government, and this commitment to crossing borders. All of these things that you have been emphasizing over the last few days are exactly what we hope to learn about as we go on this journey with you. So we're going to talk a little today about some experiences we've had developing new ways of learning about the processes and the values and the outcomes of various community initiatives at PolicyLink, or the ones that PolicyLink has been involved in. And when I was making some introductory notes, I thought I just want to tell you a few stories. And then I realized that would either look like a desperate attempt to fit in or pandering to this group of experts and connoisseurs about narrative and storytelling and community. So instead, we're going to have a lecture on comparative typologies of applied research methods for learning about the context, values, frameworks, processes, outcomes, and impacts of community-based initiatives. And the sign-up for extension credits is right outside the door. We've had a chance to get to know a number of you and to meet a lot of old friends over the last few days. But as a reminder, PolicyLink is a national nonprofit. We work with local leaders around the country so that local leaders are the basis of good federal policy and good state policy in the effort to advance equity. And so the idea of having local grantees, such as will be in the Community Development Investments Initiative, not only do their own work, but create the foundation by which we can move the field, create a movement, and maybe we'll talk a little later about what the differences are between fields and movements, is very close to our heart, regardless of the issue, because we work on education, on infrastructure, on healthy communities, on a whole range of other issues around the country. But we always have that theme. We're a hybrid organization. Research, advocacy, and communications. Those skills are all represented in the four of us that are here today. Most of the staff are not hired into one or another of those roles, but are folks who can move among them. So I often get asked, how big is your research staff? And I said, well, it's about 70 people. Well, how many people work at PolicyLink? About 70 people. How many work directly for you? Well, I don't know, maybe one or two occasionally. So we try to integrate the learning into the work of the whole organization. And we spend a lot of time on developing the popular media, the websites and the webinars and the newsletters and the reports accessible to non-technical audiences and all the work that we do. And we spend a lot of time building up the capacity of groups to do this kind of learning for their own sake and to build the field. So this is the only other slide. So once you've read it a few times, you can either read ahead, you can look at me, or you can go back to the phone or whatever else we're working on. But the 4 stories involve community learning. Learning by and with the community about change initiatives that they have, which is worth a look. Because I suspect that these methods and these approaches are things that some of you have already encountered or are already undertaking, and that you might appreciate them and work with them, and that I hope the CDI grantees will be able to modify and take forward on their own. So I have one example for each one. So the first, and rightfully first and foremost, is lifting up resident voices. None of the rest of the work that we're doing really matters if it does not reflect an authentic voice of the community. As arts and culture becomes more established, it will become more professionalized. There will be more people who are trained to do the work. But part of that training has to be keeping grassroots resident engagement, keeping indigenous communities at the front and center. This is very important in public health, and we learn the most from the community-based participatory researchers in public health. And although I'm not going to talk about that today, I would commend that to you and hope that we can talk about it as we go forward. There are so many different ways of drawing resident voice into every stage of a community development or place-making process and every stage of a research process. The example is from Market Creek Plaza in San Diego. Some of you may have heard about it because there's been quite a lot written and quite a lot of site visits. But Market Creek is the name of a shopping center and community center in southeast San Diego, created by the efforts of a private family foundation which moved into that neighborhood about 15 years ago and devoted itself to what came to be known as resident ownership of neighborhood change. So everything was designed with the residents. Everything was designed to create cultural integration and mutual understanding in a neighborhood with 9 different cultures. So public art was an essential part of the project. Engagement in the urban design of the shopping center and the community center and the park and the riverbed. A writer's block, a social enterprise for the young men who had been tagging the neighborhood. Turned into a productive enterprise, and an art program was a key part of it. So they weren't just building a shopping center, although getting the grocery store was extremely important. Starting a consignment store for goods from the cultural traditions of the neighbors. In fact, creating cultural festivals. All of the things that you all know and care about in this meeting. We were asked first to write a case study of the resident ownership process by which residents would own this property, but then to help them guide an evaluation. The key part here is my job was to work with a committee of residents to figure out what those questions ought to be. Then we can hire an evaluator after those have been figured out. The key question turned out to be, what does ownership mean to you? And it turned out they didn't have one. They had 4 categories. They had economic categories of ownership, social and community categories of ownership. Then they had both of those at the individual level. What happens to the family that owns some stock in this enterprise? What happens to the person who gets a job there? And then they had community level impacts. What happens to our shopping district, our property values, our taxes? And they had community level social measures as well as individual level social measures. What's happening to my family? What's happening to the social cohesion of the neighborhood? Once they moved from the question to the matrix and the typology of issues they wanted to explore, they could then talk about what benchmarks and indicators would be meaningful. Then they go out and find the research team. And that's what they did. And they found a lot of very important things, particularly about the unique ownership strategy. Jennifer Vanica, who was the CEO and guiding force of that effort for many years and left about 4 years ago, she's finishing up a book. The book will be called Enduring Change. It'll be out in 6 months or a year. She's finishing it up as a fellow at PolicyLink. But the core idea of resident voice in every arts project and every research project is essential. The second principle we'll call organizations creating meaningful measures of progress, growth, and change. This is where you talk back to the evaluator or the funder and say, Please don't judge us just by whether this law got passed at the end of 5 years. Look at what happened over the 5 years that took us to get there. Please don't worry about, or focus just on attribution, as Maria was saying, of total results, of trying to attribute the total results of a complex multi-part effort. Let's see if we can develop measures of progress along the way. The context for this was a set of advocacy groups trying to make legislative change, particularly in California, on public health and on infrastructure and on education and housing. And one foundation in California was kind enough to help us work with them to develop a set of methods for documenting that progress so that they could describe a benchmark and then develop indicators for their project for every step along the way. We ended up calling this GEAR, Getting Equity Advocacy Results. If you go on the PolicyLink website, all you need to do is type in capital letters GEAR, and a very clever animated graphic of a set of gears will arise to try to make an abstraction less abstract about the process of advocacy and how you would measure progress each step along the way. Building the base, naming and framing the solutions that you're aiming for once you have a critical mass of people that you've built into a base. Moving the proposal. What are all the steps of actually campaigning and persuading and moving something forward? And then building and advancing and defending what you've won. These always don't take place in a linear fashion, but you can think of them as distinct areas. You can develop ways to assess yourself. So this was also a self-defense mechanism. If you can do this as a grantee or a practitioner and give it to the funder or encourage the funder to adopt a framework like that, you are owning that process rather than feeling it being put upon you. We also created 4 more gears to go around that of the functions that are always underway: organizing, capacity building, research, and communications. Not surprisingly, tracking what we do at PolicyLink, but asking the groups, giving them guides to create the benchmarks and then the indicators, the actual measures of what their approach and progress is for each step along the way. We finished this about 3-4 years ago. We've had chances to do trainings in almost all the areas of our work, from asset building to promised neighborhoods to affordable housing, and it generally gets very good reviews. It gives people, again, a sense to own the process rather than feel like everything's bound up just with a final result or that everything is externally defined. But we're always looking for more indicators. The benchmarks are hopefully there, and the indicators are for general use, and the indicators are then things that are specific to each project. The third idea, and this is what is occupying a lot of our time, and there are many examples, I'll just give one local one. We want and we are asked to take our equity themes, our themes of just and fair inclusion, our themes of creating a society where everybody has the opportunity to prosper, participate, and thrive, making those operational. How do you create benchmarks and then specific measures and indicators of progress and outcomes for economic development activities, jobs, entrepreneurship, for affordable housing programs that are tied into more comprehensive community change, for environmental stewardship programs that aim to lift up the youth of the community. We do this increasingly in all of our work, but one neat example is in Portland, Oregon, in the Cully neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood of communities of color, but also threatened by the gentrification that is so common in Portland. A social enterprise there named Verdi and partners in a Hacienda Community Development Corporation, Native American Youth Development Corporation, have been organizing to use the social enterprise to build a park for the community, to take on extensive environmental remediation activities, to do all kinds of remodeling of existing affordable housing, to have that be a jobs program, a startup, a business incubator for local construction and environmental remediation businesses. And they made a commitment to measuring their progress, even more than their funders were asking for, and they asked us to help. We actually took the framework from Market Creek, We said and they agreed they needed economic and social measures at the individual level and the community level. What happens to the young person who gets a job? What happens to the economic level of the community, both good and bad? Are we creating a prosperity that will lead to displacement? How can we hold on? They needed social measures about the cohesion of the community and the engagement of disconnected youth, for example. But since they're an environmental project, they also needed to add environmental measures at the individual level and the community level. Environmental awareness of the people participating in the project, creating a more sustainable neighborhood, whether it was stormwater management or urban forestry. What is the education that happens as a result of that, and the engagement? And then at the community level, what's the actual improvement in the physical environment of the community? This all sounds wonderful, and it is. I think Kalima, who's leading that project with me, would agree the challenge is getting all of that done. We've now created, unfortunately, a pretty complicated set of frameworks for a bootstrap project that doesn't necessarily have the resources that Market Creek had to engage in the large evaluation. So then we're actually in a triage process of making sure we get what's most important, but that we make a pitch to the funders and even the community groups to each other to commit to measurement. But they own it. Whatever comes out of this, no one's going to say this was imposed on them. So that is a work in progress. We can track that over the next couple of years, and as we work with the CDI grantees, I think it has a lot to offer us in what we're going to learn. The last example is a little different scale, documenting and tracking field building and cross-field learning. Here, there are many collaborations of foundations with similar characteristics to ArtPlace in a number of respects, in health, in transportation, in housing, in community economic development, in work on boys and men of color. And we're often involved with them as advisors and intermediaries, and increasingly we're being asked to help them frame their measurement of progress and their measurement of outcomes. But the one in particular I'll mention today is called the Convergence Partnership. It involves 7, maybe now as many as 10 national foundations, including Kresge, who have a strong commitment to building healthy communities through policy and environmental change. This is not the group to go to if you want to talk about changing individual people's eating habits or individual people's exercise habits. This is a focus on equity, policy, and environmental change for health and health equity and healthy communities. The foundations, in fact, don't like to be called health foundations. They want to be focused on the connections between health and all the other dimensions of community life. They have put tremendous effort into various kinds of self-assessment. When they supported health groups to work on the federal transportation bill, they were breaking new ground. So they did a very in-depth case study of what it was like to build the cross-field connections between health and transportation about 4 years ago, and that has helped with their subsequent grant making at the local level. When they give grants to regional and community foundations to try to replicate the policy and environmental change for equity approach at the local level, they have done intensive analysis of how that's working. When they have a grant-making program for local foundations to extend their reach, they follow it up with very detailed qualitative assessment of how that's going and whether they have impacted the field and the community beyond the level of giving a grant. Because even when grant makers give grants to other grant makers, they still have the same questions that they have of all of you. And that information is genuinely used in the debates and dialogues within the Convergence Partnership to figure out what's next. They also have turned the lens on themselves. They survey themselves. They do candid, confidential discussions of what they are saying about their own process. And they have an openness to change, which is very remarkable and refreshing, and something of a model, I hope, for lots of other foundation collaboratives. So we are the program managers of the partnerships. We don't do that evaluation for the most part, but we help design it, set it up, contract for it, and see that it meets everybody's needs. So you can see we've had a chance to watch people own these processes. And what we're hopeful for over the next couple of years as the CDI grantees get underway is that we can learn from these examples and some others and help you and help ArtPlace design the kind of learning that suits your needs as well. Thank you.
Okay, so remember when I said we weren't going to talk at you, we were going to talk with you? It's 11:15 and it's time for our break. So I apologize, and I want to sort of come up with, this is my version of Shift Happens, that I think the point was to start a conversation today. And to say that we want to actually be hearing from grantees. So two things that we're going to do a little bit differently to adapt. Prentice is going to be doing the next session, which is also a town hall style section. So he's going to actually exemplify how research and field building are working together. And we're going to leave some time, and I'm going to come back up on stage and have a chance to get into some of the things that I've asked you to think about. What are the examples in your own projects where you're measuring, where you're documenting, where you're doing research already. So you will have a chance to share that during Prentice's session in a little bit after the break. Also, I am going to take on the challenge of having you all email me, set up a call. The research@artplaceamerica.org email address is a live, active address that we're using. And it's something that I sort of want you all to take advantage of, see as a resource. I want to hear everything that you possibly want to tell me about the work that you're doing, whether it's a question about help that you need in terms of what types of measurements you want to be doing, or examples that you want to share. Maybe this will turn into an interview project or a documentation project of our own where we can start to share your stories in some other way. So this is my version of trying to adapt to have not having left enough time this morning. I really want to thank again our three speakers presenting the sort of range of ways that research can take shape within this creative placemaking experiment that we all have going on. So a big round of applause to them.